Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leaders in Lending. I'm your host, Matt Snow, joined this time by Chris Pilkerton, former head of the Small Business Administration, current author. Chris, good to see you again. Welcome.
Hey, Matt, thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I've got a copy of your book right here, Plandemic. Great book. Really enjoyed reading it. A lot of good detail and I think a good summary of going through COVID and kind of the reaction and lessons learned. So maybe we'll get into that in a second, but uh, you want to take a second to introduce yourself and tell me what you're up to today?
Sure. No, Matt, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much. Um, as the book talks a little bit about, I started my most recent turn in government in 2017 as the general counsel at the Small Business Administration. And, the SBA is just this tremendous place to work because the mission is amazing. And the people that work there are really so committed to it. The folks that are careers that have been there. In fact, I had two lawyers on my staff that had been at the agency for almost 50 years. And so you have a lot of people that stay. They don't really bounce around the government because they're just really committed to the mission. And so that was something that struck me right away. And it was a very hands-on place. In other words, when small business owners had questions or what have you, people were picking up the phone, really being helpful. You hope the government would be. And at the time, Linda McMahon was the administrator. And as you may know, she was CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment. Her and her husband started that organization. And so she was a true business CEO. And so when I first met with her, what she was looking for was someone that was a lawyer who was interested in policy, had that experience, but also had litigation, compliance, regulatory experience. And all of that really translated in sort of the business general counsel that I was looking for. So I was involved in a lot of the meetings across the board from a policy perspective with the different agencies, with some of the other secretaries. And then in April of 2019, she stepped down. And so the White House named me to be the acting administrator. Now, you never quite know how long those positions are going to last. It could last a week or 2 weeks, but there's a whole process where obviously in a Senate confirmed position, someone actually has to get confirmed by the Senate. Well, the individual, Jovita Carranza, wasn't confirmed until January of 2020. So I was in the role for almost a year as the head of the agency. And it really was just an amazing experience. And I talk about how incredible it was in the book, but in large part because it's so hands-on. You're meeting with the small businesses. You're seeing the impact that technical assistance and the loans really make in their businesses, their lives, their families, their communities. And then when the pandemic started, I moved over to the White House, and that's where I talk about in the book sort of my experience within the White House, what was happening with the Paycheck Protection Program. And one of the things that I saw that was so impactful during PPP was the impact of community development financial institutions, organizations that were literally inside these communities who were lending and making a huge difference, particularly in underserved communities. And so when I left the administration, I ended up going to work with Axion Opportunity Fund, which is where I am now as their general counsel. And it's the leading small business CDFI focused exclusively on small business. And so it's a great place, some tremendous folks. So it's sort of like the nonprofit extension of the SBA. So you asked what I'm doing now. That's what I do. I've done a couple of fellowships, and one of the fellowships that I finished up at the Kennedy School was really the basis for the book Plandemic and all the research. So it's been a really fun few years, and I'm just really committed to this space, and it's all kind of worked out well.
Yeah, that's great. You could find that combination in Axion with small business and the CDFI. We've gotten some great partners that are CDFIs at Upstart, and I've learned more about that space. I wasn't quite as aware prior to joining, and yeah, the ability that they have to really impact communities that they are in is really meaningful. So that's really cool that you get to do that. And small business is hugely important to the American economy. So again, like seeing those stories through your book was really great to read about. And maybe like starting with the end, like Do you think we got it right? Like through the COVID pandemic, the stimulus, all the programs around PPP, like the focus on small business, what's your assessment? Did we get it right? Was that the right reaction? Is it too early to tell?
I don't think it's too early to tell, because if you talk to folks on both sides of the aisle, left and right, lawyers, policy folks, particularly economists, given the circumstances that we were in at the time, I think it absolutely was the right thing to do. And in large part because the options were really limited. When you go back to 2008 and you think about the Great Recession and different financial crises that we've had, these have all been issues sort of related to liquidity in the financial system. So cash infusions, all the things that had happened really were ways to sort of manage that. But in this situation, we didn't know when the virus was going to end or would be able to kind of get control of it. So the approach that was taken with the Paycheck Protection Program was really to sort of, keep workers tied to their businesses so that they could continue getting paid, so that they can continue health insurance and all of these things that are just, so important for, any family living in America. And there were some external pieces of this too that folks may not necessarily know about. And I talk about this in the book is, one of the questions that I've been asked by various economists is, well, why didn't we just do a massive unemployment program? Like, why didn't we just go ahead and inject money into the unemployment system? And there was a very significant unemployment piece associated with the CARES Act and pandemic programs. But one of the reasons that it wasn't done that way was because the unemployment system is set up state by state. There's a federal component, but really it's state operated. And some of those operations were actually programmed, 40, 50 years ago on COBOL programming language. So, there were so many possibilities that if there was just one tweak, one issue, and a system goes down, what does that mean for, a community, particularly communities living paycheck to paycheck? And so this was the approach that was chosen. And I do think that when you look at the number of jobs that it saved, and there's a lot of scholarship out there, on the high end, on the low end. But even on the very low end, it was, the millions of jobs that were saved. And so what I try to do in the book is take a look at it really in, a bipartisan way and say, what did we do well? What did we do? What were the challenges? What are things that we could do better the next time? And the reason I think it's important to do this book now, in fact, I was speaking to one reporter about just doing an interview of the book, and he said it's called Plandemic. Because wow, Eeyore, that's a really like title that's gonna turn people off. And I said, no, the point of it really is to put the plan together now. The idea that if we work on these things and we work on them not just at the executive level, but you work with them with Congress, and then you're working within the communities. And so I think, at the end of the day, it's about planning and preparation, and it's about getting feedback, not just from the communities, not just from the politicians, but, to the point you made before, also the lenders, right? What worked? What were we putting more regulatory burdens in this process than lenders could really handle? I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with lenders that said, look, we got this guidance, within a few days before. And I think everyone understood that a lot of this was being done in real time. The legislation was lightning fast from a legislative perspective. But then there's the whole process of rules and, just FAQs and guidance and those kinds of things. And that can be, difficult for anyone to absorb, particularly, large lending institutions that have a lot going on anyway. And so going back to the planning idea, now we can sit down as a government, sit down with lenders and say, look, if we were in this situation again, what would make the most sense to you? How would you be able to assess these loans? And how would you be able to get money out the door? Because at the end of the day, you're talking about a program that was about $800 billion. And the lenders were the tip of the spear, getting the money out the door.
Yeah, definitely. I want to come back to a piece of that because the logistical challenges I didn't really appreciate until reading through this book and really like laid out a lot of those challenges, like you said, from a local to a national level, all the different layers of government and finance and the public sector and private sector working together, and how to bring that all together. Especially as you mentioned, like speed as the mandate, right? So if you think about all the different possible solutions and what do you orient around, I think this crisis really called for speed as like the primary focus. So maybe talk a little bit about that. Like how was a solution able to come together so quickly, partnering, like you said, with CDFIs, in market, fintechs, traditional banks? How do you get all of those different stakeholders involved, as well as Congress and rule makers, and figuring out how to manage a program like this?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you go back to when it actually was happening, because remember, this was COVID, right? So most government employees were not in the office. So you had this small group of folks within the SBA and Treasury, and Treasury was really the big lead on this, who were committed to getting money out the door. And to your point, speed was the most critical factor. And there was a lot of conversations that were being had, not just with lenders, not just with trade associations, but with different communities on what's the most effective way to do this. I myself, after the FAQs came out, I would do all kinds of meetings and webinars with trade associations and different groups, and literally try to get thousands of people on these and just explain sort of the nuts and bolts of the process. Well, when you're explaining the nuts and bolts of a process that started 24 hours ago, you're going to find issues, right? What about this situation? What about that? So people would say, well, these FAQs are coming out, and then 24 hours, there's more FAQs. And then 48 hours from there's more, information and what have you. And that was just the nature of it. And I think, with hindsight, I think everyone understands and appreciates that, because it was being run through the SBA, but it was a new program. As a lender, the 7A program, which is the flagship program at the SBA, it has very specific rules, rules like credit elsewhere and some of these other sort of lending SBA terms, but they weren't applicable here. But while you're trying to get the money out the door, there certainly was the understanding that you also have to be as responsible as you can. I think, when you're talking about $800 billion, is there going to be fraud in a government program that big? I think anyone would say, yes, something is going to happen, right? And there's different estimates on what the sizes of those are. And obviously the Paycheck Protection Program wasn't the only issue there. But the reality was, at the end of the day, this was a way to keep people, like I said before, tied to their jobs, tied to their health insurance, and get them through whatever that period was. And it goes back to the point I made before. We didn't know how long that period was going to last. And for me, it was really interesting because when I was doing the research in the book, I not only looked at the United States, but I looked at a number of other countries and sort of how they did things differently, particularly through Europe and Asia, and found that the way that they looked at the pandemic was in sort of a rescue period, so called maybe the first 4 or 5 months of the pandemic, and then a recovery period. And so a lot of the things that they did were based on, how do we build these businesses back up? And I think the U.S. process, there was elements of that, and the rules of the PPP did change somewhat. But I think there are pieces of that, particularly around like deregulation and things that can be done on the very local level to help small businesses. I mean, the perfect example is, we all heard about how local ordinances were pulled back so folks could do takeout and sort of be eating outside and all those kinds of things. And those are small, but anyone that's ever worked with local government before, that stuff doesn't necessarily happen overnight. And when I was at the White House, I would do conversations with mayors and governors and local economic officials. And I mentioned this in the book that, some folks had a sense of what they wanted to do or needed to do. They would all tell me that their first top three problems were obviously health and safety for their communities, concern around the small businesses, and then housing, because obviously the small businesses tie into the workforce. But there were some mayors, and I didn't really blame them. They didn't know what to do. And when you get a call from the White House, you're thinking, all right, I'm going to get the answers. But the role that I had, I was trying to find out, what they needed. And it ended up becoming this sort of fascinating, policy process for me, because I would, talk to a mayor in one city that they still had shovel-ready construction jobs where they were trying to lay fiber optic line through bridges, but they didn't have workers who were trained to be able to do that. And then I'd speak to a mayor in another city that actually had a makerspace or workforce development center where they were training people to do that. So, trying to find ways to match people up. And so it goes back to, once again, that preparation that certainly has to be done at the federal level. And I sort of make the case that, going back to the FAQs and things that I mentioned, you could pre-write some of these things. There's always going to be a need to tweak, and the circumstances are going to be different, but you could pre-write some of that. You could pre-write maybe some of the emergency legislation, recognizing that, no matter how bipartisan it is, it's still Washington and people are going to have their own takes on things. But if you had, the bulk of the project plan ready, then for the next crisis, and I'm not talking about a health crisis, just a, sort of I'll say a garden variety economic, circumstance, those kinds of things could be implemented. And it may not be as easy as flipping a switch, but you certainly wouldn't have to start from scratch.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. A lot of great detail in there. And maybe on a lighter note, one of the things I still remember about that time, whenever my wife and I order from our favorite Mexican restaurant here, we live in a small rural town in Ohio. Things move a little slower. We order our margaritas to go, and I can get that in that cup. It always feels a little weird driving back home with a margarita next to me. But a sealed cup, it's a reminder of some of the innovation and pushing the boundaries a little bit as we're trying to help small businesses stay alive and afloat through that uncertain time. But you also mentioned, I was struck by a couple maybe seemingly extreme concepts in the book too, where you talk about the correlation to healthcare, and maybe we can talk about Dr. Osler a little bit, but the idea of, washing your hands is the best preventative medicine, or, those simple things that you can do can help keep you out of trouble long term. Not that it's going to prevent a pandemic, but, how do we think about planning ahead and doing those essential things, but also in those times, kind of extreme remedies for extreme diseases and being fast. So maybe talk a little bit about the parallels you saw there and that through line as you discovered Dr. Osler and his following.
Yeah. So Dr. Osler was a physician who was one of the founding physicians at Johns Hopkins University. And whenever I write, I try to come up with some metaphor that connects the circumstance, back to the reader in a way that's digestible. And for this book, really focused on the idea of what Dr. Osler brought to medicine. So every medical student who, or any doctor who's listening to this, had to read a book by Dr. Osler. And he has one of the foundational books that's required for medical school. And, he lived in the 1800s into the early 1900s, but he's sort of known as the father of modern medicine. And he's known for that in large part because he brought to the medical community this concept of medical students doing rounds, actually engaging with patients as opposed to just learning from a book. And he was at Johns Hopkins, and then he was over at Oxford, and he would really engage with these students. And, he had apparently the best medical library in America at one point. And so students would come to his house, and he would actually give them keys to his house, and they would research at his house and in his library. And they got this nickname, the latchkeyers. And these students would come in, and apparently on any given night, some doctors would come, some professors, and it would sort of turn into this party of just a discussion, all these different folks, this sort of salon of people just talking about it, like on, a random Tuesday or what have you. And so I thought it was really important to use that as the example of kind of the doctor-patient relationship, because in these circumstances, of course, the private sector was incredibly important, but the government was setting the stage. And in large part, these small businesses were the patients in this circumstance. People always use the phrase that small businesses are the engine of the economy, they're the backbone of the economy, and that's all true. But in this case, they really needed the help and they really needed the support. And so Osler was also a bit of a character and had some really great sayings and phrases. And so I use some of those in the book, as you referenced, to really kind of talk through what are ways that we can kind of learn to really apply some of the lessons of the pandemic. And you talked about sort of the idea of clean hands sort of just being the best antiseptic. And that, I think part of that is true. It's just common sense, right? And so I think a lot of this is common sense. And that was the experience that I had inside the walls of the White House and inside the government to be able to do that. But, I think, look, something is going to happen again. And being prepared for it and understanding it, it's not just about reading the history of, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. It's not about reading the history of the pandemic. Sure, that's going to help. But if we actually have an action plan in place that is practical, it's not one of these blue ribbon commissions where former governors and, former whoever are sitting on it. Those are fantastic and they have their place. But in this circumstance, you need people who were there, or at least very close in time, including, when I say people, I'm talking government, lenders, small businesses, local officials, to really help put this together. And so my hope is that this concept and these suggestions will be picked up. And fortunately, I've had some good conversations with policymakers, and I think they will.
That's great. Yeah. And I think one of the other things that struck me is, I think we joked about this before, like the idea that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So I think you do a good job of comparing not only, health-related pandemics, but other disruptions in the economy, whether that's, war, terrorism, other, massive shocks that disrupt the economy. So, not being so specific about like, another disease-driven shutdown of the economy, but like what else can we learn from and how can we prepare? So I like the correlations you draw throughout the book as well through that. But do you see, like, in the short time after the pandemic, like, are we thinking proactively about some of these things? Is there stuff that's changing? Or you mentioned the state unemployment systems being written on COBOL. Are those being upgraded, or are there tangible things, or is there like another hungry wolf at the door that's taking our focus away, and like, maybe this is a distant memory that we're focused on the next urgent thing?
Yeah, I think right now, we're taping this on October 9th. And so at least the United States is certainly focused on an election in a few weeks. And there's still a hangover, I think, from COVID, from the pandemic, right? There's still small businesses are still feeling it. There's still obviously, the small business optimism index has been low recently in the face of inflation. Some of that having been done are accountable to, a lot of the spending that happened over the last few years and those kinds of things. So I think we're as a country, maybe we're not ready to do this yet. But as I alluded to, conversations that I've had with folks, this just makes sense, right? No one has come to me and said, Chris, I don't think we need a plan. Because I think, people who are on the right and the left appreciate and understand that. And I really do think that this can be bipartisan. The legislation for the CARES Act was ultimately passed in 5 days. which is just amazing when you think about how long these conversations can go on the Hill, much less, actually getting a vote. Now, granted, it was obviously emergency circumstances and an incredibly unique time. But one of the other quotes I have in the book is from Louis Pasteur, and he says, it's the microbes who will have the last word, right? So we can't pick the time when this is going to happen. So we've got to prepare now.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation, Chris. I know you've got another project you're working on, which I'm anxiously awaiting. Is there any other piece of advice or thought leader, other book, podcasts that you want to leave the audience with, maybe to stay up to date with stuff like this, or how they might follow you?
Yeah, so you can follow me on X at @CPilkerton. One of the projects that I'm working on right now is the impact of artificial intelligence on small business and workforce development, and what we can expect going forward. And I've had these tremendously fascinating conversations with all kinds of AI small businesses that are they seem to be popping up everywhere, but people always talk about the greatest business successes are 15-year overnight sensations, right? They've been really working at this for a while. And so there's just some amazingly interesting products out there. And I think in the context of sort of what we're looking at current events right now, what does automation mean for the workforce? When I was back in the administration, this ties back to the pandemic, I had the chance to go down to spend time in North Carolina in some of the advanced manufacturing centers they had there to support sort of reshoring textiles. And one of the ones that I worked on or was working with was focused entirely on apparel. They were working with some of the big apparel companies and doing T-shirts and shoes and all these kinds of things. And a lot of it was, coded in the background. You didn't necessarily see the workers in the factories, but there was a lot of technology that was being developed by the workforce. Well, what they ended up doing during the pandemic, they called me and said, we know that people need masks. We know that people need gowns. They turned their entire operation on a dime and started creating this. And what was really fascinating to me was it was almost like this World War II effort. And it showed the importance of the domestic manufacturing supply chain. So while I'm also looking at AI and looking at the impact, I'm really hoping, that as a country, we start focusing more on these manufacturing ecosystems. So as a country, we're producing, we can be more resilient when it comes to supply chain issues. And I think things like that will ultimately help the next crisis.
Awesome. Well, yeah, like I said, looking forward to it. Hopefully you'll come back once you finish your research there and share more of what you learned in that.
I would love it, Matt. Really appreciate the time today. Thank you.